On the 19th of September 2022, Queen Elizabeth II, the longest reigning monarch in British history, was laid to rest. If you watched the funeral live on television, or merely caught some of the wall-to-wall coverage of the event, then you will have noticed this place here. It is St George's Chapel, the royal church at the heart of Windsor Castle. St George's Chapel is one of the traditional burial places of the British royal family. Queen Elizabeth's husband, Prince Philip, her sister, Princess Margaret, and her father, King George VI, are all buried here, along with many famous and not so famous members of the royal family from throughout British and English history. Yet, often overlooked, you can find within the chapel a plaque commemorating an African royal, one Prince Alemayehu of Ethiopia. And this plaque reads, "I was a stranger, and ye took me in." You can find the grave of Alemayehu just outside St George's Chapel. His story is largely forgotten in the UK today, but is more indicative of the role of the royal family within the dark history of British colonialism than any of the royal graves you will find within the chapel. Prince Alemayehu was kidnapped in 1868 at the age of 7 by a British general called Sir Robert Napier. Sir Robert was the head of a punitive British expeditionary force sent to Ethiopia to punish Prince Alemayehu's father. The Napier expedition would subsequently go on a bit of a looting spree. It is estimated that the British Army of 1868 took home more Ethiopian artefacts than any previous conquering army in the long history of that country. Prince Alemayehu was, quite literally, part of the loot. As both of Prince Alemayehu's parents had died during the expedition, he was awarded to Queen Victoria, officially as a ward, but really more of a curio that she would bring out at parties or have appear in pictures to add a certain level of exoticism. I wonder what Prince Alemayehu thought, as Queen Victoria, the woman whose government was responsible for the death of his parents, would say about him, and I quote, "A pretty, polite, graceful boy. There is nothing whatever of the Negro about him." Prince Alemayehu hated England, and he hated the racism he encountered there. He would, throughout his childhood, repeatedly ask to go home. He was repeatedly ignored, and died on the 14th of November 1879 at the age of only 18. At the request of Queen Victoria, he was buried in Windsor Castle. Recently, much has been made of the violence of British colonialism, and indeed we can see that in Alemayehu's own story. He was, after all, brought to Britain by a conquering army. But in Alemayehu's story we also see one of the other tragedies of colonialism. For, at least in a material sense, Alemayehu was well cared for. He, after all, grew up in royal palaces. He was given nice clothes, and, if Queen Victoria's diaries are any indication, his captors seemed to be genuinely fond of him, in a sort of patronising kind of way. Yet, the British had robbed him. They robbed him of his parents, they robbed him of his home, and they robbed him of his agency. And throughout it all, they told him they were helping, and expected him to be grateful. Indeed, it doesn't even seem to have occurred to Queen Victoria, or anyone at her court, that Alemayehu, taken as a child from his family, from his friends, from his home, would be anything other than thankful. Prince Alemayehu's story also shows how Britain has never really came to terms with its dark colonial history. From time to time, the Ethiopian government has requested the return of the bones of their prince. Elizabeth II, much like her ancestor Queen Victoria, would repeatedly refuse or simply ignore all requests for the repatriation of Alemayehu. And so, more than 140 years after his death, Alemayehu remains a captive. His restless bones buried in the ancestral vault of the very family who kidnapped him.